to, there we go, presentations that people want to be tuning into. It's also going to let you know that the recording is going to be available on our website. Okay, so New Hampshire Lakes, just a quick rundown for any of you who don't know who we are. We're the only publicly supported nonprofit organization working for all of New Hampshire's 1,000 lakes. You can support us and the programs that we're offering for free, like this webinar series, by going to our website today at newhampshirelakes.org. Our mission is to keep all of our lakes clean and healthy now and in the future. We work with partners, promote clean water policies and responsible use, and inspire public care for our lakes. We do that through our programs. We do some house if you're interested in getting involved there, because we always, our lakes need more voices, of course, and you can contact Michelle. She is our advocacy program manager. We also offer our conservation programs, our lake host program, which many people are familiar with, making sure that boats are not going into or coming out of our lakes with aquatic invasive species, and our newish Lake Smart program, where any homeowner, whether you live on the lakeshore or far from it, can learn about things that you can do on your property to keep the lakes clean and healthy. And then, of course, our outreach program, which is bringing you our webinar series tonight. Group Pony Automotive Group is a longtime supporter of New Hampshire Lakes, and they've been wonderful enough to sponsor our 2021 series. They're a great organization to work to buy a vehicle from. My last 2 vehicles have come from Group Pony. If you're interested in a vehicle, I would highly suggest reaching out to them. They make it quick and easy. They're located in Bow. And I'm your host this evening, Erin Mastine. I'm the Outreach Program Coordinator. I'm being joined by Gloria Norcross. She is our Conservation Program Assistant. And your experts this evening, Wendy Scribner, she's the Forest Field Specialist at the UNH Cooperative Extension, and Robert Craycraft, the Lakes Monitoring Program Coordinator at UNH as well. And if I've gotten your titles wrong, I apologize. You can introduce yourself with your correct titles. That's what I found online. And that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point and turn it over to our experts. And Bob, you said you were going to kick it off, so I will give it to you.
All right. Thank you, Erin. So let me share my screen here. All right. Can everybody see that slide? Okay, so Wendy and I are gonna give the presentation together. I'm going to start off, talk a little bit more about the water quality end of things, and which is my area of expertise. And then Wendy is going to certainly follow up and talk more about the forestry management, which she's one of our county foresters. We have a forester in each county through Extension, which more generally, Extension is really the outreach arm of the university, if you're not familiar with us. And we're really dedicated to taking the knowledge from the university and generate it elsewhere and relaying it to the public at large. So we're there effectively to help citizens of New Hampshire out. But for tonight's talk, we're going to talk about healthy forests and healthy lakes. So here's one of the many lakes in New Hampshire. This is Mount Chocorua looking up at, or Chocorua Lake rather, looking up at Mount Chocorua. Again, one of our forested lakes. And what I'm going to do is just kind of give you some background information on water quality, but try to give it a little bit of a flavor from a forest management standpoint, or the value of forests for protecting water quality. Oops. Let me see here. Oh, so sorry, I'm having difficulties going to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So when I typically talk about water quality and water quality monitoring impacts, I like to first just set the stage and talk about more generally lake aging. And all water bodies, all lakes go through a natural aging process. Our larger lakes certainly were created during the last glacial period, the last ice age, so roughly 14,000 years ago. These depressions got scoured out. And after that occurs, lakes start out pretty young. So this is really showing, and we use some jargon terms as well. So you're going to see some terms on here associated with lake aging that are used by scientists. But effectively on the left-hand side, we have young lakes. On the right-hand side, we have older lakes. And when a lake first is formed, typically it's going to have sparse, as you can see on this slide, sparse plant growth, low amounts of algae, which are the microscopic plants that color the water green, very clear waters. You can see down deep into the water column, high oxygen throughout, rocky, sandy bottoms, cold water fishery. And then over a geological time frame, so we're talking thousands or tens of thousands of years, these lakes naturally age, become more nutrient enriched, and with that, the plant growth becomes more abundant. There's more algal growth, and we've heard about cyanobacteria in the recent past. So cyanobacteria become more prevalent, or blooms become more prevalent. Waters become cloudier. We lose oxygen. The bottoms get muckier. So again, it's a natural aging process. Lakes go through it. And one of the key things to know is it is natural, but it also can be accelerated if we're not doing things carefully. So certainly we have a history of not developing watersheds really well, putting houses where maybe they don't belong, putting roadways where they don't belong. Particularly 100 years ago, we didn't know better about many of these things. So historically, we did things poorly. And even some of our forestry practices historically, we didn't use the same practices to minimize impacts as we do today. So we'd clear a hillside, and all the effectively soil would run off into the lake. So these are things we really have to consider as we're thinking about water quality, but it is a natural aging process. So just keep that in the back of your mind. When we're dealing with water quality, we're working at the watershed scale. So the drainage basin to a particular water body, whether it be a lake, a river, could be a wetland, a vernal pool, whatever it may be. And I just use Newfound Lake as a good example because it's nice in terms of having some high ridges around it. So we have Mount Cardigan rather to the left. If you've ever been in the Newfound Lake watershed, you might have gone up to Sculptured Rocks, geological areas, but it's a nice area many people are familiar with. But it really gives you a perspective of this watershed scale. Anything that happens in that drainage area is also ultimately going to make its way down to the lake and via the water flowing downhill. So what we do in these drainage basins can adversely impact the lakes, or alternatively, really have a positive impact on the lakes, the water bodies. One of the concerns in New Hampshire, both a pleasant component as well as a concern, is we're predominantly forested state, but on the other hand, there's a lot of people that want to live here, and that's not a bad thing. We all need a place to live. The key is how we manage the landscape when we're developing it, because the forested landscape does a lot better job of protecting water quality than when we have houses around it. And certainly the New Hampshire Lakes has been really good about putting out a series of workshops, webinars to talk about things that can do to minimize or improve water quality. And there's a lot of things you can do on these residential lots, but just keep in your mind, if we don't do things well, don't do things with some forethought, we can really have an adverse impact. So when we're talking about lakes, oftentimes we talk about nutrient loading, and particularly the nutrient phosphorus. The phosphorus tends to be the most limiting nutrient in freshwater systems. And certainly there are other nutrients of concern, but nutrient tends to be the one that really comes to the top of the heap. And it tends to be sticky from the standpoint that it travels into lakes largely with sediment washout. It can also be dissolved in the water flow through septic system leachate or fertilizer applications and other things, just natural wildlife in the woodlands. contribute too, but there is a lot of phosphorus in the soil. So anything we do to destabilize the soils is going to have potentially an adverse impact on our water bodies. This slide is really intended to give you some perspective of the value of vegetation. So a forested landscape is going to have some of these characteristics where when the water comes down, the rain comes down, it's going to be captured by the trees and by the understory. So some of that water is going to evaporate out of the soil and some of it directly off of leaves. So it reduces the amount of water that's running off. Some water also is lost through transpiration. It's taken up through the vegetation and then lost through the leaves back to the atmosphere. And that can be a good thing in terms of managing the runoff that's occurring. I mean, certainly during a dry period, if you're dealing with a shallow well, it might be an issue for you. But from a water quality perspective, in terms of runoff into the lakes, it's normally a good thing. Another thing is the understory contains a forest duff layer. This is the decomposing material. So if you walk through the forest, you oftentimes step and it can be kind of spongy, and that's all that decomposing material. And that does act like a sponge. When the water comes down, it helps retain that water. So instead of that water flowing overland into the streams and into the lake and picking up contaminants, it allows that water to infiltrate through the soil and be purified naturally. And this slide just gives you some idea of what the changes can be when you go from a forested landscape to a more urbanized landscape. And a lot of it has to do with the pervious surface or impervious surface if it's more developed. So impervious surfaces would be things like roofs, roads, anything that doesn't allow the water to infiltrate. And what you see on this slide is on the left-hand side, the forested landscape. When the water comes down, you have a appreciable amount of water that's infiltrating into the ground, recharging the groundwater, some water running off, and then there's a lot of evapotranspiration, the water that's going back into the atmosphere through evaporation and that transpiration process. When you get to a more urbanized setting, particularly when you get more down to an area like a Manchester, where it's just really heavily developed with buildings, roads, houses, there's an appreciable amount of runoff and significantly less water infiltrating back into the soil. So it really illustrates some of the value of retaining these forested buffers, these forested landscapes. And that's not to say these developed areas are a bad thing, but you have to manage them very differently. So Mother Nature really has imposed a mechanism to control these pollutants and the runoff naturally, whereas we have to use some engineering designs to do it when we develop the landscape. Water is pretty powerful when it comes down. So this is just a drop of water impacting the soil, and or in this case, probably impacting something like a gravel road, but it could impact a forested landscape as well. But whenever you have bare soil, the water can come down and it can really dislodge fine particles. And those fine particles, as I indicated, carry with it a lot of contaminant in the form of phosphorus and other things attached to the particles as well. But a lot of phosphorus runoff can occur when you have this bare soil. So again, that vegetative landscape can really help reduce the amount of contaminant running off into our water bodies. This is an example. This happens to be in the Newfound Lake watershed. If you ever go up to the AMC Lodge at the base of Mount Cardigan, this is Shem Valley Road, but it gives you an example of a rainfall event, or after a rainfall event, what happened. Just a lot of washout. In this case, it was a gravel road, but you could see this in a forest, a logging operation. If things aren't done carefully, a logging road can actually have some runoff. And there's certainly a lot of things that can be done to prevent some appreciable runoff. And I think Wendy can probably address that a little bit more in her talk. But if we're not doing things carefully, we can really have some problems. This is an example of a house where things weren't designed properly. And mind you, this is my house. So we all have our ghosts, our demons that we have to deal with. But what we have here is my roof line up here. This is the drip edge. And then this is just a blow up of the drip edge with a quarter in here to show you the scale. But what happens when it rains is that water comes off that roof impacts the soil and it displaces the finer materials. So it really gives you a good example of what happens. And you can see what's left behind here and over here, just the coarser material. So I don't know if you folks watch the talk on gravel road maintenance by Russ Lanoy, but he does a great job of talking about the composition of good gravel. This is definitely not good gravel, but also a lot of fine material has been displaced, and that's flowing downstream. Fortunately, I do have some forested land over here, but if you go further to the right, you don't see it, but there is a vernal pool over there. So I have some concerns on my property as well. So just to show you, these are the types of things we want to contend with. And when this was a forested landscape, that duff layer and that forested area would have helped keep things in place much better. So this is an example of things not being developed right, really, or developed well, but also there's some need to do some further mitigation, and that's upon me in this case. Going back to the example of Newfound Lake, these are a couple of slides just showing you the Newfound watershed. The slide to the left is land cover. So the green is different types of vegetation. And what you can see from this just visually is it is predominantly forested. The red is more developed areas. So around the periphery of the lake, there is some red. If we zoomed in, you'd see it a little bit more. Yellow is hay fields largely, but predominantly a forested watershed. On the right-hand side, it's showing you the slope classes. So the darker the coloration, the steeper the slope. And again, if you've ever been over there, Mount Cardigan is over here on the westerly edge of the watershed. It's a lot of ledge outcrop, a lot of really steep slopes. So when it rains, it can really run off rapidly. And fortunately, it's predominantly forested. But even the forested landscape, if we don't use the proper measures when we're doing forestry practices, we can have an adverse impact. And certainly with some residential development, we also exacerbate some problems and potentially could accelerate that natural lake aging process. Back in 2001, we had Tropical Storm Irene come through, one of the more intense storms that we had. We certainly had a wet August and July this year rather in particular, but Tropical Storm Irene dwarfed that in terms of the intensity of the rainfall. And on this slide, you can see Newfound Lake, about 6 miles long, over 4,000 acres in size, really deep lake, about 187-foot max depth, about 60-foot mean depth. We had sampling locations located all around the lake. The deepest point in the center of the lake that we sample is 153 feet, just to give you some perspective. And after a tropical storm, oh, one more slide here. And this is just showing you, just so you can see long-term trends of rainfall versus what we got during that month of August when Tropical Storm Irene came through. So really intense rainfall in August, and it actually continued into September, but unusual rainfall that really had a great potential of causing some problems. This is showing you water transparency measurements that were collected at multiple sites on Newfound Lake before, immediately after, and then more distantly after Tropical Storm Irene. It's not unusual. So what we have on the y-axis here is water transparency in metric units. So these are meters. So 8 meters is about 25 feet or so. So it's not unusual to see water transparencies in Newfound Lake of 25 feet to 30 feet. Really clear lake. But what you can see is Tropical Storm Irene came through right about here. And then immediately after, this cluster of data points, all sites showed water transparency go down to about 2 meters. So about 6.5 feet. The lake turned a good brown color. And we weren't trying to differentiate what was causing this, whether it was, forestry practices, home site development, gravel roads. But clearly I was there 2 days after this event, and there was a road agent waiting for FEMA to come out to evaluate whether or not they'd be receiving an appreciable amount of money to mitigate some of the washout problems. And the person I talked to, the road agent, said this was in the town of Groton. He said he had to bring in a few truckloads of fill to get the one stretch of sculptured rock road back operational. So all that, and that runs immediately next to a stream that drains into Newfound Lake. So it was just a tremendous amount of material that ended up displaced into Newfound Lake. And again, going back to the Russ Lanois talk on gravel roads, there's a consistency to this material. And a lot of it does consist of clays to help hold things together. So those are the fine particles washing out. Clays have a lot of surface area and tend to transport or bind with a lot of phosphorus. So effectively, I could extrapolate this out. We didn't have a lot of nutrient data immediately after Tropical Storm Irene, but just looking at the Secchi disk and knowing the color of the water, there was probably a lot of phosphorus in there with those fine silts that washed out. I put this in here. One of the things we do when we're talking about water quality is we in doing watershed management work is we talk about phosphorus coefficients, how much phosphorus is coming off the landscape per unit area per unit time. So these are kilograms of phosphorus per hectare per year, and these are broken. So that's what the Y scale is. And then the X scale is just different types of land cover. So we have agriculture here, urban agricultural cleared combination here. And then this cluster over here, deciduous, very high deciduous content, over to the non-deciduous, which is basically coniferous with some wetlands in it, I believe. These are all forested components. And what I really want to point out here, and these also are based on New Hampshire studies done through Department of Environmental Services and UNH, looking at phosphorus loading values. So this includes lakes like Squam Lake, Newfound Lake, Sunapee Lake, Kezar Lake up in Sutton, Doors Pond in Manchester, Beaver Lake in Derry, and I think there were a couple others, but various watersheds. But these are numbers based on those watersheds. So each of these classes has a range of values, but what you can see is in the urbanized setting, much higher values than what you typically see in the forested landscape. So if any of you tuned into the modeling workshop, they talk about some of these coefficients, and some are generated by studies like this. And another great source of information for New Hampshire is through the Hubbard Brook Experimental Station, which is a research forest in the state of New Hampshire. So it's a great source of information for the Northeast. And they do studies, very controlled studies on some sub-watersheds up there. Just a couple final slides I wanted to bring up and lead into what Wendy's going to be talking about. But this is just a collage of some forested areas. This one up in the left-hand side is Hayes Brook in New Durham. Then these other images are some streams over in the Newfound Lake watershed. So the upper image here in the left is just a nice forested watershed. There's a lot of forested watershed in Newfound, but I really wanted to focus on some of this bank undercutting. And it's really important to keep in mind that when you modulate the volume of water coming through and the rate at which the volume comes through a stream, a channelized area, it can really have a positive or a negative impact on the water quality. When you have these real high flow periods, it can really undercut the banks, and ultimately these banks will collapse in. So you can see all three of these are showing you there's a lot of potential for collapse. And naturally, this will occur in our watershed. So this bank undercutting isn't always a bad thing. It's certainly bad when it's happening in excess. But a couple of things I will point out, maybe in a more positive sense, is one of the things is you can see, particularly this lower left image, this tree is ultimately going to collapse in there, but the root structure is kind of like Mother Nature's rebar. It's holding things in place. So this would have otherwise collapsed probably long ago if you didn't have this structure in place. And likewise, there's some grasses up here. And this is another example, some shrubs over here to the right, lower right. It's amazing what vegetation can do to hold things in place. And this is holding things in so you don't have that sediment washout. And with it, that sediment washout brings with it a lot of phosphorus loading. But some of these nooks and crannies, if you want to call them that, they're great habitat for fish. So when the stream levels, or it could be lake levels as well, because you sometimes get this along the shoreline, it can have some positive implications. You'll find stream insects in there, and that's a food base for fish. Fishery will get in there to get out of the flow. Also, naturally, if this is occurring, now, again, you don't want it to happen because you have excessive discharges, but sometimes it happens naturally. And maybe you tuned into the talk about the fishery management. There was somebody from Fish and Game, and I didn't watch it myself, but one of the things Fish and Game talks about is coarse woody debris in the stream. So when these trees fall in there, they can basically dam up the streams a little bit naturally, and you don't want this in excess, but to some extent it's good. It creates habitat for fish and macroinvertebrates, so it can do some real good things, but you want to make sure it's happening in a controlled sense. So all this bank undercutting isn't necessarily a bad thing, but when it's happening in excess, it can be a problem. And certainly when you start losing that forested structure, you have a greater potential for some problems if you're not careful. And then one final slide leading into Wendy's talk is talking a little bit more about vegetative buffers. Is they can really provide you some seclusion if you're living next to a lake, particularly on a lake. So sometimes I hear that people get irritated that people are on the lake looking at their houses. But sometimes the shorefront has been made devoid of vegetation. So this is an example of a house located a little bit away from the lake, but with this vegetative buffer so that people can see out, but they're somewhat protected in this particular case. But vegetative buffers provide a low-tech, high-performance solution to pollution runoff problems. Sometimes when you're talking a stormwater management, you can talk about non-structural or structural best management practices. Structural would be things that are engineered. So something like a rain garden could be a structural BMP, which are really cool things, really important. And there was a talk that was given on during this seminar series, I believe, that talked about things like that. So they're great measures to put in place. They have a lot of value, but there's also a lot of value in maintaining this non-structural BMP, if you will, which is the natural vegetation in place, which has both the vegetation, but also the undulations of the landscape. So there's nooks and crannies to capture water and other pollutants before they run off. And with that, I'm gonna stand down and turn it over to Wendy, who can talk more about forestry practices and hit upon some of the pests that are plaguing our forests right now.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Let me just go ahead and start sharing my screen. Oops, let's see. Slideshow. Okay, so hopefully this is showing up on your screens. Just wanted to follow up with what Bob was talking about with the vegetated buffers along our public waters, our lakes, and our larger streams. If you own waterfront property, you're likely very familiar with this picture that outlines the waterfront buffer, as well as the woodland buffer zones. And so really the Shoreland Protection Act provides regulatory protection to keep that buffer intact. It's so important as far as reducing sedimentation, reducing nutrient and pollution moving into our waters. So that's really the spirit behind the Shoreland Protection Act, is to protect those buffers. Of course, the most regulated area is within that first 50 feet, that waterfront buffer area. And if you've ever considered removing vegetation from your property, you've likely looked at the point system that's set up for the number of trees, the number of points that you need to have before you can start removing trees. And again, it's all in the spirit of keeping that buffer intact, keeping those root systems intact that are holding that material, that are taking up water and intercepting those nutrients before they reach the lake.
Wendy, I hate to interrupt you, but we're still seeing the slideshow in speaker view instead of audience.
Okay, let me see if I can I'm glad you mentioned that because I'm looking at it full on my screen here. So let me see. Oops. All right, let's go to previous and then let's end the show and let me figure this out. Okay, slideshow. View.
I think if you go back to slideshow and then just select from beginning over there.
I thought I had done that. Are you still seeing the speaker view?
We are.
Okay. I do not know how to get rid of that.
Looks like it changed slightly now. Oh, now it's back.
All right, let's see. Review. All right. View. Slideshow. All right, let me see if I can figure out. I just don't know how to get rid of it. I haven't run into this before. No, that's not it. What does that do? Oh, I'm still seeing the speaker view on.
Yeah, I wonder if you, I've never run into this either. It's always worked when I hit from beginning, but that little duplicate screen from the top.
Duplicate screen from the top.
So if you see, do you see this little icon where that looks like from beginning? And then if you go up to the red bar to the right of save, there's another one.
Okay. Duplicate bar, go up to the red bar. Next to save.
Yeah, over just a couple, that one. Yeah, the little caret to the right, there's a start from beginning. I don't know if that might make a difference.
Okay, I just clicked on that, still not.
And if you can't figure it out, it's not the end of the world to just go through with us seeing it in this mode either.
Wendy, are you using multiple monitors or just one?
There we go. How's that? I
Perfect.
do have perfect. Okay, great. All right. Let me just move this out of the way. And again, I apologize. We'll move on through here. Let me get that out of the way. Okay, so timber harvesting does not fall under the regulations from the Shoreland Protection Act. But it is regulated in shoreland areas. We have what's called the New Hampshire Basal Area Law. And what that says is, again, it's trying to maintain buffers along public waterways. There's a 150-foot buffer along our great ponds greater than 10 acres, as well as fourth order streams, where only half of the density of trees can be removed in any 1 year. And that we use basal area, that's jargon, basically referring to the density of trees. And I won't go into how that's all measured, but bigger trees have more basal area. So this really pushes for keeping a well-distributed stand within that 150-foot buffer of our lakes, as well as our larger streams. And then we also have buffers under the basal area law for perennial streams that aren't fourth order of 50 feet, where only half of the density of trees can be removed. So those are protections in place, legal protections in place to protect water quality. Also on timber harvests, if you need to get a wetland permit for any reason, which often you have some sort of stream crossings that are involved with any timber harvesting operation, then best management practices for erosion control on timber harvesting operations. These practices come into play, and they're required on a timber harvesting job. So that includes a whole bunch of practices that have to be used to minimize erosion and sedimentation. So the biggest key really probably comes down to good planning and layout of your timber harvest, so that you are, having a minimum impact in these riparian or streamside areas, using things like ditching, cross drainage culverts to move water through. Broad-based dips are another practice that are used during a timber harvest. And then, for example, water bars would be used following a harvest to direct water off of those truck roads and those skid trails, trying to get it into the duff layer of the forest, so that it will then infiltrate and not pick up those soil particles and move them along the roads. In a lot of cases, a timber harvesting contract will call for reseeding your major truck roads using a conservation mix, using mulch, again, to stabilize those exposed soils. So these are all some regulatory protections that are in place. Oops, let's go back, to protect these buffer areas. We also have some great resources for how landowners can voluntarily protect buffer areas. If you own forest land, I would encourage you to check out this publication, Good Forestry in the Granite State. The publication is available for free, all on the website. It's got great information about our timber types, things that you can do to enhance wildlife habitat, and things you can do to protect special areas, including things like vernal pools, seeps, springs, and riparian or streamside management areas. And so not to get into too much detail with this, this just shows on the right column some of the legal requirements with the basal area law. Good Forestry in the Granite State provides some additional recommendations, expanding those riparian management zones, as well as in some cases suggesting no harvesting zones within close proximity to some of our different water resources. And I like this slide because it really encapsulates a lot of the functions that those buffers are playing. Everything from bank stabilization, Bob mentioned fisheries habitat, particularly important to have shade over our streams for species such as brook trout. It's also important to have branches and tops and trees falling into those streams, providing coarse woody debris, basically creating these riffles and pools that allow for deeper areas in the streams that can provide some refuge when we have really hot, dry summers for those species that need cold, oxygen-rich water. But also nutrient removal, sediment control, and for folks that are really interested in enhancing wildlife habitat, keeping these buffers as large as possible, will allow for wildlife movement and along these buffers. So I wanted to switch over it now and talk a little bit about keeping the vegetation healthy within these buffer areas. I'm frequently talking with landowners who own properties with shoreland along the lakes, and they're often concerned about the health of their trees. And so I thought I'd share some of the things that I talk with folks about when I meet with them out on their properties. So the first question that often comes up is, is this a healthy tree? And so I would encourage you, when you're out on your property, to be taking a look at some of your trees. One of the things to look for is you want your trees to have big, healthy crowns with lots of leaf surface area. This is really where all of the energy production is happening in the tree. So the bigger that crown, the more energy that tree is producing for its life functions. But not only that, for defensive mechanisms. So for being able to fight off insect attack, disease, being able to wall off decay. So healthy trees are going to be much more able to do that than those trees, if you think about the ones that have the little lollipop tops. A good rule of thumb is a healthy tree should have anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of its total height in live green growing crown. This tree likely had that, the tree in the picture here. This is an ash tree. I'll be talking a little bit about emerald ash borer in a couple of minutes, but you can see there's a lot of dieback in this tree. It's very normal to see dieback at the bottom of the crown where branches are getting shaded out, and that's not necessarily a health concern. But when you see dieback happening up at the top of the tree where there is full access to sunlight, that's typically an indicator that there's some sort of stress going on in that tree. So that's something to look for, as well as looking for signs of disease, decay. If you have wounds on your trees, looking for how well that tree is responding in sealing over those wounds. This can all tell you a bit about how your trees are dealing with stressors. Some other things to look for, structural defects, large cracks. I see a lot of large white pine trees struck by lightning, particularly around the lakes. Weak branch unions that can break apart in a storm, evidence of decay, fungal fruiting bodies. Most of our tree diseases are fungal. And with decay, the concern is that those decay fungi break down the structure of the wood. There's less strength in those trees, and they're much more likely to fail. Just because a tree has decay in it, though, it doesn't mean that it, is necessarily unsafe and needs to be removed. Again, if those trees have nice, healthy crowns, they're able to continue growing, to continue to add diameter growth, putting on good solid wood that can keep them alive and structurally pretty sound for years and years. Sugar maple is a great species for, looking pretty awful with lots of decay, but actually being very structurally sound, even when they look pretty bad. Just want to touch briefly on roots and remind folks that the root systems can extend out from trees 1 to 2 times the tree height. In most of your tree roots, 95% of them are going to be in the top 18 inches of soil. So if you're doing site work, it's important to keep that in mind. If you do sever the roots, cause significant injury to the roots, you're going to see a corresponding dieback potentially in the top of the tree. Here's an example with an old maple tree up in Conway. You can see here we've got impervious, gravel road behind this tree. A parking lot was put in on top of the tree. The grade was changed. And you can see the tree responding to all of this compaction around it and lack of good soil with the dieback in the branches. So I wanted to, well, we still have a few minutes, talk about a couple of invasive insects that are really have an influence on our lakes. One of them being the hemlock woolly adelgid. This insect was first found in Portsmouth in the year 2000. It's devastated native hemlock forests to our south, and it can kill trees in our area in anywhere from 4 to 10 years. The insect itself is a tiny little insect about the size of the head of a pin, but it produces this woolly coating around itself and its eggs to protect itself. Here you can see the insect itself and the extent of where we're finding hemlock woolly adelgid throughout the state. All of the maroon colored towns, that's where new infestations were found just this last year. Hemlock woolly adelgid, they feed on the stems, the tiny twigs of the tree right at the base of the needles. So I encourage you, if you have shoreland property, to check out your hemlock trees, look for signs of this insect. These are just some images from states further south of us, showing what can happen when these insects are given the chance to build their populations up. Fortunately, in New Hampshire, our winters can knock back anywhere from 30 to 80% of the hemlock woolly adelgid population in a given year. Unfortunately, because we are having warmer winters, I think that's why we're seeing this insect be able to spread, and we're starting to see impacts. I'm starting to see it along the eastern side of Lake Winnipesaukee, where I am visiting with landowners. Also, the hemlock, elongate hemlock scale, I'll just mention it's another invasive insect. We're also finding this in combination with hemlock woolly adelgid. And when you find both of these insects, it's just additional stresses on the trees, and it can cause the trees to die sooner when you have both insects attacking the same trees. So this is why I think of it as a big problem around our lakes. This is a park along Lake Winnipesaukee. If you look at the tree species here, it's almost entirely hemlock. Hemlock has great ecological properties. It provides great cover for birds. It's great in our deer yards, providing winter cover for deer. It can grow on a lot of different soil types, everything from very dry to very wet, and it's very shade tolerant. When I first looked at this park, the first branch I grabbed to look for hemlock woolly adelgid, I found there is hemlock woolly adelgid in here. Some of the crowns of these trees are looking sparser, so a lot of these, some of these needles are beginning to die. And so I look at the function of this particular vegetated buffer and wonder what it's going to look like, 5-10 years down the road. And again, I'm seeing, more and more of this insect appearing on the east side of Lake Winnipesaukee. So that's one of my concerns, is what's going to happen to some of these trees that people also use a lot or rely on as screening in between properties along the lakes. A couple of things to know about hemlock woolly adelgid: it's transported by birds, animals, and the wind. That cottony covering or woolly covering is very sticky. So it gets onto bird feet, it gets onto bird feathers, it gets onto squirrel toes, and it can be moved to new locations. The populations tend to be sort of clumped. So if you like to feed the birds and you have hemlock on your property, I'd encourage you not to hang bird feeders in hemlock trees, because you're just going to have birds flying into those trees, landing there, and potentially infecting those trees. We just had an infestation in Conway where I think birds traveling from the edge of the forest to the bird feeders across the yard may have brought in the hemlock woolly adelgid in that particular location. So I'd encourage you to monitor for these pets, and then consider planting other trees in addition to the hemlock that is already there. Things like red spruce is a good shade tolerant species that is not affected by hemlock woolly adelgid. If you're primarily concerned about screening in the winter, some deciduous trees and shrubs can help augment those hemlock trees that are providing that benefit. I would encourage anyone that's interested to check out nhbugs.org. This is a website that we run with the New Hampshire Division of Forests and Lands and UNH Cooperative Extension. There's a lot of information about hemlock woolly adelgid, emerald ash borer, and a lot of other forest pests to be watching for. There's also a place where you can upload information if you find that you have any of these insects, and the state is tracking new infestations. So you can provide your information and help us keep up to date about where those infestations are. Great information on the website about controlling hemlock woolly adelgid. There are chemical controls that you can use on important landscape trees to protect them. Here, our forest health specialist is applying a basal bark treatment. It's a pesticide treatment that you spray directly on the hemlock tree bark. So it's very targeted to that tree. And it can be used following rules, having a pesticide applicator, licensed pesticide applicator involved, having special permits. You can treat some trees in the waterfront area. If you're interested in doing that, I'd encourage you to check out the New Hampshire Division of Pesticide Control. Talk to them about where you're located, what you're interested in doing, and they can tell you what the requirements are for getting the necessary permits and what's allowed in your particular area. Particularly, they're looking at maps where there are public well intakes, public water intakes, that sort of thing. Let's see, how are we doing? We're really close on time, I think. So I'll just mention emerald ash borer is out there. It kills trees within 3 to 5 years. This is where it's located in New Hampshire. The dark purple are new infestations this year where it's been located. Concern about emerald ash borer, it tends to, it makes up about 6% of our forest, but it tends to like the soils that are found along streams and where there's good moisture and nutrient levels. So you often find it in combination with sugar maple and basswood. So there are some ecological concerns about losing that shade, losing some of that root structure around streams where we have higher prevalence of ash trees. Main thing to know about emerald ash borer is that as this killing front comes through the state, 99% of the trees, larger trees larger than say 3 inches in diameter, are going to be killed by this insect. So if you have high value trees that you want to protect, there are chemical treatments that can be done to protect those trees. In that case, chemicals are injected directly into the base of ash trees, again, to move systemically throughout the tree and kill any of the emerald ash borers that are feeding on it. And so with that, some other resources, if you're interested in landscaping and in how to incorporate different layers of vegetation into your landscaping. Landscaping at the water's edge is a great resource. That's also available free. If you Google that, the whole book is available online. And with that, I will turn things over for questions.
Okay, thank you both so much. We did have a couple questions, but I think you answered them already. Let me just double check. Yep, asking about how to treat for the different kinds of pests and how we can control them and how to report them. So you answered both of those questions after those were typed into our chat box. I do welcome anyone, if you do have an additional question. We have about 4 minutes here, well, 3 minutes left before we're going to sign off. If I have any questions, we'll get those answered. And if not, I guess we'll just say thank you both so much. It was very informative. thank you, Bob, for giving us some shout outs for additional webinars that we've had that touched on a lot of the topics you're already talking about. Let's see here. We did have a quick question. Do the chemical treatments also kill good insects? Cheryl wants to know.
Yes, they do. They will kill any insects that are feeding on, if you're treating a hemlock tree, any insect that's feeding on the hemlock or any insect that's feeding on the ash tree. As far as pollinators go, because that's often a concern, hemlock trees are wind pollinated, and ash trees, the flowers are not, they're not insect pollinated. So, so fortunately, they'll have a minimal impact on our pollinators, but they will kill any insect that is feeding on those trees. I can see another question about chemicals being safe to use near lakes and streams. That's something that if you are considering using these chemicals, they are very targeted, is what I can say. And the way you apply them can be very targeted. So you can minimize exposure. That basal bark treatment, is you're going to be a lot less likely to get that chemical into the groundwater, into the surface water. And so while there are other techniques, soil drenches, things like that, foliar spraying, choosing the right type of application can really minimize the outside impacts. But there are some good references. If you go to that NHBugs website, there's a good article on the chemicals that are used for controlling emerald ash borer and the impacts of those chemicals on water quality. And so it covers some chemicals that you could also use for hemlock woolly adelgid. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that and learn more about the potential impacts. As far as birds being impacted, from what I've heard, the birds tend to not be interested in they're not going to feed on dead insects, and they're less interested in dying insects. So they're able to be somewhat selective in what they're eating. But that's a good question as far as particularly with the emerald ash borer. Woodpeckers are feed heavily on those larvae.
And what trees to replace them near the lake and streams would you recommend?
There are going to be a number of things that you'll want to consider there. How much sun are you getting in that area? What are the soils like? That sort of thing. The nice thing about hemlock is, because it can grow in the shade, and it tends to keep its lower branches. Those are great features. Whereas, if you have good sunlight, white spruce could be a tree that would be good to be planted as a screening tree. It does well on pretty dry sites, but you really want to look at the characteristics of your site to figure out what are going to be the best choices based on the amount of sunlight, soils, water availability, all of that.
All right. Well, we are a little bit over here, but I just have a quick follow-up question for you, Wendy, with that. Are the county foresters, are those the people we'd want to reach out to have come look at our property and give us some examples of trees to have planted?
Absolutely. I'd encourage you to reach out to your county forester. We can either come out to the property, talk with you about what's going on there, or through pictures. You can send us pictures. We can look at what's going on there, look at where your property is, and provide some recommendations. Also, I'll put a plug in for the New Hampshire State Forest Nursery. If you're looking for tree seedlings, native tree seedlings, their latest catalog has just come out. If you Google New Hampshire State Forest Nursery, you can get, 15 seedlings for $20. So it can be a really good way to get some native plants and do some of that interplanting.
Great. And having a county forester come to your property or look at photos is free, correct?
That is correct. Yes. Yep. And if you go to our UNH Cooperative Extension website, you can find out who your county forester is, get the county office phone number, or send us an email. All of our information is on the website. And so, yeah.
It's a great resource for us to have here. That's amazing. All right, well, it's 8:02, so we're going to say goodnight. Wendy, Bob, thank you again so much. This was very informative, and I hope everybody had a wonderful evening. And I hope you tune into our next webinar next month. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.